Welcome back to our channel World of Royals.
Picture a world where every headline hides a deeper agenda, every smile masks a secret, and every past decision waits patiently for the perfect moment to resurface. For years, the public has watched the Duchess of Sussex rise from Hollywood fame to royal prominence, admired by some and questioned by others. But just as her carefully curated image reached its peak, whispers from within her own bloodline began to grow louder. They say the people closest to you hold the keys to your past, and in this case, those keys may be unlocking doors long kept shut. What started as family tension has now spiraled into something far more explosive. Claims, revelations, and unsettling accusations are beginning to paint a picture that challenges everything the world thought it knew. As shocking details emerge and old narratives begin to crack, one question hangs in the air. Is this the moment where everything begins to fall apart? The first crack in the carefully constructed image didn't come from a tabloid headline or a palace insider looking to stir controversy. It came from somewhere far more unpredictable, far more personal. Within the fractured dynamics of Meghan Markle's own family, a voice that had long been dismissed suddenly became impossible to ignore. Thomas Markle Jr., known for his outspoken and often controversial remarks, delivered a statement that sent ripples across both media circles and royal watchers alike. But this time, it wasn't just bitterness or family resentment that caught attention. It was the weight behind his words and the implication that what he knew went far beyond public perception. What made this moment different wasn't simply the accusation itself, but the way it was delivered. There was no hesitation, no ambiguity, just a quiet certainty that suggested something deeper was being hinted at. He didn't just criticize. He implied knowledge. He suggested there were elements of Meghan's past that had never been fully revealed, pieces of a story that had been carefully left out of the narrative presented to the world. And in an era where public figures are built as much on perception as reality, that kind of suggestion carries explosive power. For years, Meghan had crafted an image that blended Hollywood success with humanitarian purpose, a transition that seemed almost seamless when she entered the royal spotlight. To many, she represented modern royalty, independent, articulate, and globally influential. But the emergence of claims from within her own family introduced a contradiction that the public couldn't easily reconcile. It raised a question that lingered beneath the surface. How much of what people believed was the full story, and how much had been strategically curated? As these remarks began to circulate, they ignited a chain reaction that extended far beyond a single interview. Conversations that had once been dismissed as fringe speculation suddenly gained renewed attention. Old narratives resurfaced, and previously ignored details were re-examined under a new lens. In the digital age, information rarely disappears. It waits, quietly archived, until something triggers its return. And in this case, that trigger had arrived. What followed was a shift in tone across media platforms and online discussions. The focus moved from admiration to scrutiny, from celebration to investigation. Observers began connecting dots, revisiting timelines, and questioning inconsistencies that had once gone unnoticed. The story was no longer just about a royal figure navigating public life. It had become something more layered, more complex, and far less predictable. But perhaps the most significant impact wasn't on Meghan alone. It extended to Prince Harry, whose role in this unfolding narrative became increasingly complicated. As the husband who had publicly defended and supported his wife against criticism, he now found himself at the center of a growing storm that challenged not just her image, but his own judgment. The contrast between the life he had chosen and the questions now being raised created a tension that was impossible to ignore, and as the situation continued to evolve, one thing became clear. This was no longer a contained family dispute or a passing media cycle. It was the beginning of a much larger narrative shift, one that threatened to reshape how the world viewed not just Meghan Markle, but the entire story surrounding her rise to global prominence. As the initial shockwaves from those family revelations continued to spread, a second layer of the story began to take shape, one that didn't originate from relatives or emotional grievances, but from a completely different world altogether. The entertainment industry, with its long memory and hidden networks, started to re-enter the conversation. And with it came voices that carried a different kind of weight. Individuals who dealt not in opinions, but in alleged records, private dealings, and stories that rarely see the light of day unless something forces them into it. One such voice belonged to a figure who had spent years operating behind the scenes, someone familiar with the darker corners of celebrity culture where reputation and reality often collide. His past interviews, once overlooked and dismissed as sensationalism, were suddenly being revisited with a new level of seriousness. What had once sounded like background noise now felt uncomfortably specific. Details that were previously ignored began to stand out, locations, timelines, and descriptions that painted a picture far more concrete than vague rumor. According to these resurfaced accounts, there had been whispers years ago about material that allegedly existed, content that, if proven real, could significantly alter public perception. At the time, those claims were brushed aside, categorized as the kind of stories that emerge whenever someone rises too quickly into the spotlight. But now, in light of the recent family statements, those same claims were no longer being dismissed so easily. Instead, they were being connected, aligned, and examined as part of a larger narrative that seemed to be building piece by piece. What made this development particularly unsettling wasn't just the nature of the allegations, but the precision with which they were described. Specific years, specific locations, even references to individuals involved in the alleged chain of events. In a media environment saturated with vague accusations, specificity carries a different kind of impact. It suggests either remarkable fabrication or uncomfortable truth, and for the audience watching this unfold, distinguishing between the two became increasingly difficult. As discussions intensified, online communities began doing what they do best, digging. Old clips resurfaced. Archived interviews were clipped, shared, and analyzed. Social media threads expanded rapidly, each attempting to piece together fragments of information into a coherent storyline. And with every new post, the narrative seemed to gain momentum, moving further away from isolated claims and closer towards something that felt interconnected. But this wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about timing. Why were these stories reemerging now? Why did they seem to align so closely with the growing tension surrounding the Sussexes in other areas of their public life? For many observers, the convergence of these elements felt too precise to be coincidental. It suggested that something larger was at play, a moment where multiple threads were being pulled at once, unraveling a narrative that had once seemed tightly controlled. Amid all this, the pressure on the couple intensified. Public perception, once shaped by carefully managed appearances and messaging, was now being influenced by forces far less predictable. And as the conversation shifted from admiration to skepticism, the foundation of that public image began to show signs of strain, because in a world where image is everything, even the suggestion of hidden truths can be enough to change everything. Just as the narrative began expanding beyond family disputes and resurfaced industry whispers, a third dimension entered the spotlight, one that carried an entirely different level of influence. This time, the conversation wasn't being driven by relatives or anonymous online discussions, but by individuals positioned much closer to elite social circles, voices that, whether critics or commentators, had long-standing connections to institutions the public rarely sees from the inside. Among those voices were commentators and biographers who had spent years observing the royal family and the people who orbit around it. Their statements didn't arrive as emotional outbursts or vague insinuations. Instead, they came wrapped in composed delivery, measured language, and an air of quiet authority. And perhaps that's what made them so impactful. They didn't need to exaggerate. The implications alone were enough. What they suggested wasn't necessarily a direct confirmation of the more extreme claims circulating online. Rather, it was something subtler, yet arguably more powerful. They hinted at inconsistencies, at carefully managed narratives, at details that didn't quite align when examined closely over time. They pointed toward patterns, shifts in behavior, and moments where public statements appeared to conflict with documented timelines. For the audience watching all of this unfold, it created a new kind of tension. Up until this point, much of the narrative could be dismissed as either family resentment or internet speculation. But when individuals with perceived credibility began raising questions, the conversation changed. It moved into a space where doubt became harder to ignore. The center of this evolving situation was the growing perception that the story surrounding Meghan Markle had always been more complex than it appeared. Not necessarily false, but perhaps incomplete. And in a world where public figures rely heavily on controlled storytelling, even small gaps in that narrative can create significant consequences once exposed. As these observations gained traction, they began to intersect with earlier claims in unexpected ways. Points that once seemed unrelated started to connect. Statements made years apart suddenly appeared to align under a new interpretation. And with each connection, the narrative gained a sense of cohesion that made it increasingly difficult to dismiss outright. But while much of the focus remained on Meghan, the ripple effects continued to reach Prince Harry. His position became more complicated with each passing development. Once seen as someone who had stepped away from royal life in pursuit of independence and protection for his family, he now appeared caught between two worlds. On one side, the life he had chosen. On the other, the growing list of questions surrounding that choice. Observers began to notice subtle changes, shifts in public appearances, differences in tone, moments where his usual confidence seemed replaced by something more restrained. Whether those perceptions were accurate or simply projections from an increasingly engaged audience was unclear. But in the court of public opinion, perception often carries as much weight as fact, and as this new layer of voices continued to add their perspective, one thing became increasingly evident. The narrative was no longer being shaped by a single source or perspective. It had become a convergence of multiple viewpoints, each adding its own piece to a puzzle that was still far from complete. Because when stories begin to align across different levels of influence, from family to industry to elite circles, they create a momentum that becomes very difficult to stop. The narrative continued to spiral outward. What once appeared to be a series of isolated controversies began to converge into something far more dangerous, a perfect storm where public perception, private pressure, and financial reality collided all at once. And at the center of that storm sat the very foundation that was supposed to define the Sussex legacy, their carefully branded world of philanthropy, purpose, and global influence. For years, that foundation had been presented as proof of a higher mission, a transition from royal duty to independent impact. It was meant to symbolize freedom, control, and a new chapter untouched by the constraints of tradition. But when scrutiny began to fall on its inner workings, the narrative started to shift in a way that was impossible to contain. Reports began surfacing that raised uncomfortable questions, not about intention, but about execution. Observers noted inconsistencies, gaps where transparency should have existed, and delays that didn't align with the polished image being projected publicly. In an era where credibility is currency, even minor discrepancies can trigger major consequences. And here, those discrepancies were beginning to stack. What made this situation particularly volatile wasn't just the numbers themselves, but what they represented. This wasn't simply a financial issue. It was symbolic. The foundation had become an extension of identity, a reflection of values, and a cornerstone of public trust. And as that trust began to weaken, so too did the structure built around it. Behind the scenes, the pressure reportedly intensified. The expectations that came with maintaining a global brand collided with the realities of managing it. Staff turnover became a topic of quiet discussion, with insiders hinting at an environment that was far more demanding than it appeared from the outside. What had once been framed as a dynamic, fast-moving operation was now being described in more strained terms, a place where the pace and pressure created cracks that were becoming harder to hide. At the same time, the broader public narrative continued to evolve. The earlier allegations, the resurfaced stories, and the elite commentary were no longer separate threads. They were now feeding into a single, unified perception, one that suggested instability rather than control. And in a media landscape driven by momentum, perception can quickly become reality. For Meghan, this convergence represented something deeper than a reputational challenge. It struck at the core of the image she had spent years constructing. The idea of control, of carefully shaping how the world sees you, was now being challenged from multiple directions at once. And when that control begins to slip, even slightly, It can create a cascade effect that becomes increasingly difficult to reverse, but once again, the impact didn't stop there. For Harry, the situation was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. The role he had chosen, that of protector, partner, and ally, was now being tested under conditions that were far more complex than anything he had faced before. Each new development added another layer of pressure, another question, another moment where the line between public duty and private reality became blurred, and as financial strain, public scrutiny, and personal tension continued to build, the narrative reached a point where it could no longer be dismissed as temporary turbulence. It had become something more permanent, more structural, and far more revealing, because when the systems designed to support an image begin to falter, they don't just expose weaknesses. They expose truths. As the pressure from every direction continued to mount, the story reached a point where speculation began to give way to something more tangible, a sense that the carefully balanced world surrounding the Sussexes was no longer holding together in the way it once had. What had started as whispers and isolated claims had now evolved into a full-scale narrative shift, one that questioned not just the past, but the future. The center of this turning point was Prince Harry himself. For years, he had positioned his journey as one of escape, a deliberate step away from tradition in pursuit of something more authentic, more controlled, more his own. But as the current situation unfolded, that narrative began to face its greatest test. Because leaving one system behind only works if the new one remains stable. And now, that stability appeared increasingly uncertain. Observers began to focus on subtle but telling developments. Decisions that once seemed strategic were now being reinterpreted through a different lens. Movements between countries, renewed interest in old connections, and the growing emphasis on security all started to form a pattern that raised difficult questions. Was this about protection, or was it about positioning? Was it a continuation of independence, or the beginning of a return? The idea that Harry might be seeking a pathway back, not necessarily into the same role, but into the same world, began to gain traction. And with that idea came an entirely new layer of complexity. Because returning wouldn't just require physical movement. It would require reconciliation, negotiation, and perhaps most challenging of all, a redefinition of everything that had been said and done in the years prior. At the same time, the public narrative surrounding Meghan continued to intensify. The accumulation of allegations, commentary, and scrutiny had reached a level where it was no longer about individual claims being proven or disproven. It was about the overall weight of the story being told. And that weight was becoming increasingly difficult to carry, for a figure whose strength had always been rooted in communication, in shaping narratives and controlling perception. This moment represented an unprecedented challenge, because the conversation was no longer being guided from a single source. It had fractured, spreading across platforms, voices, and perspectives that couldn't be easily managed or redirected. And as that loss of narrative control became more apparent, the consequences extended beyond reputation. They touched on identity, on legacy, and on the long-term viability of everything that had been built since stepping away from royal life. For Harry, the emotional dimension of this situation added another layer entirely. The contrast between loyalty and doubt, between public defense and private reflection, created a tension that was as personal as it was visible. Every decision carried weight, not just in terms of public perception, but in terms of what it meant for his future, his family, and his place in a story that was still being written. As all of these elements converged, one reality became impossible to ignore. The narrative had reached a crossroads. The direction taken from this point forward would define not just the next chapter, but the entire legacy of the Sussex story, because in the end, it was never just about titles or status. It was about control, truth, and the price of rewriting your own story in a world that never stops watching.